Now I'd like to introduce you to our featured speaker today. Our speaker is Kartik Hosanagar. He is Professor of Technology and Digital Business and Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Kartik's research work focuses on the digital economy, in particular the impact of analytics and algorithms on consumers and society, on internet media, internet marketing, and e-commerce. He's been recognized as one of the top 40 business professors under 40. He's a frequent recipient of MBA and undergraduate teaching awards at Wharton. And on the business side, he's co-founded and developed the core IP for Yodel Inc., a venture-backed firm that was acquired by Web.com, and has served on the advisory boards of Milo, which was acquired by eBay, and Monetate Inc., and is involved with other startups as either an investor or board member. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kartik. Thanks for being with us.
Gordon, thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you all for joining. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think of highly at a high level as the algorithm economy, but in particular recommendation systems. And this talk is on how well do recommendation engines work for your product. So recommendation engines or recommender systems are systems that attempt to predict items of interest to users based on some information about those users and about items or products. They're known to have a pretty significant impact on consumer choice. And so in this talk, I'm going to focus on how do they affect product success. That is, what kinds of products benefit more from recommendations. So I'll begin by briefly introducing recommender systems and their role in internet retailing, but also more generally online consumer experience. I'll then talk about their impact on product success. And we'll look at this in two parts. First, I'm going to ask how much do they help mainstream products versus niche products. And second, going beyond just product popularity, I'll ask what kinds of product categories are they more strategic for? So for example, wines versus books, baby products versus office supplies, or highly rated products versus products with lower or average ratings. So we'll look at some of these things. I'll then share details about an experiment we ran with a very large online retailer, share details of the data set itself, and then what we found through this study. And of course, I look forward to any questions you have. So recommenders, as we know, are widely used online. So they're used in retail. For example, there's the classic Amazon message of customers who bought this also bought this. And of course, there are variants of that. People who viewed this also viewed this. People who viewed this eventually purchased this, and so on. Beyond retail, these systems are used in media. So for example, Netflix uses recommendations to personalize our experience. Pandora uses the same idea to personalize our experience with music. YouTube does the same with video streaming. And in news, Google personalizes news stories, again, based on the kinds of content that we are already consuming. Now, these systems are widely used, and there are a few different designs, but for the most part, the most commonly used design is what's known as a collaborative filter. Now, a collaborative filter essentially finds other users with very similar consumption patterns and recommends what else they liked or viewed or purchased. So the classic collaborative filter is people who bought this also bought this. Now, these systems are used widely in various retail and other settings, and they're known to have a very significant impact on consumer choice. So for example, a paper that was published by data scientists at Netflix indicated that about 80% of video streams at Netflix originate through personalized recommendations. Another independent report suggested that 35% of purchases at Amazon originate from recommendations. So that's a pretty significant amount of economic value created. If 33% of Amazon purchases originate from these systems, we're talking about billions of dollars of economic value created. So while we know that they impact consumer choice, we don't really have as deep an understanding about what kinds of products do they help. Are they helping all products in a catalog equally, or are they more strategic for certain kinds of products? And that's what I'm going to try and tease out today. And as I mentioned, I'll do it in two parts. First, we'll look at, do they help mainstream products more, or do they help niche products more? And second, what kinds of product categories are they more beneficial for? So that's essentially what we're going to try and tackle. But before I go into the data set and what we found, let me make these two questions or these two kinds of managerial applications a little more concrete. So first, I mentioned that we might be interested in looking at whether they help mainstream products more or do they help niche products more. And that relates to the popular long tail theory. And that theory essentially says that the internet gives the long tail, meaning the niche products, a chance that they would not have had before. The idea is that mainstream markets focus on mainstream products, and internet tools and technologies, including recommendation engines, allow consumers to find these products that are closer to their preferences. And so we decided to try and test that. And so what we did was we partnered with a large online retailer. We had a control group of consumers who received no recommendations and a treated group that got recommendations using these collaborative filtering algorithms. And then we essentially looked at sales of niche products versus the sales of mainstream or popular items. And then we explicitly measured and tried to come up with a quantitative measure of what is the net impact for niche versus popular items. To do that, we computed what is known as a Lorenz curve. It sounds a little complicated, but it's actually a fairly straightforward idea. It relates to the standard 80-20 principle that we have all heard of, and that principle is that 80% of sales are generated by 20% of products, and the question is, how true is that before recommendations and how true is that after recommendations? So in this figure that you all see in your screens, I have a graph where in the x-axis we are essentially listing products in ascending order of sales. So the item with the lowest number of sales is on the leftmost side in the x-axis, and the item with the greatest number of sales will be on the right-hand side. And on the y-axis, we are listing the fraction of sales generated by these products. So what that curved dark line is indicating is that the bottom 40% of products generated roughly around 5% of sales. The bottom 60% of products generated about 20% of sales. And so this is this idea of, what percentage of sales was generated by what percentage of products. So that curve, the dark curve, is known as the Lorenz curve. The 45-degree line that you guys see is essentially what the Lorenz curve would have looked like if all products had equal sales. Well, if all products had equal sales, the bottom 40% of products would have generated 40% of sales. The bottom 60% of products would have generated 60% of sales, and so on. And the Gini coefficient is a measure of the area between the Lorenz curve and the 45-degree line. So if the Gini coefficient is 0, that means the Lorenz curve is pretty much the 45-degree line, and it implies all products have equal sales, and this is an egalitarian market where every product gets consumed in equal amounts. If the Gini coefficient is close to 1, it's a market where one product generated all the sales. So this is a winner-takes-all market, and it's a highly concentrated sales world. And so essentially we are asking, does the Gini coefficient increase or decrease because of recommender systems? And so that's one thing that we're going to look at. So that's as far as how recommendation systems aid or hurt popular versus niche products. Now next, we also looked at which products benefit, but not so much from product popularity perspective, but from the perspective of product categories. So on your screen right now, you folks see a snapshot of a recommendation on a retailer's website, and these are recommendations that show up when I visit a furniture product, and when I visit that product, I see a bunch of recommendations, and they are all products that are in the home category, usually furnitures. And if I happen to click on one of these products, I go to a landing page. And now the question to be asked is, what determines whether I buy this product after clicking on it from a recommendation? So in particular, I clicked on the product and I visited this page. Will I buy it or not? And does the recommendation help? And if it helps, does it help more for this product here, which is a futon mattress within furnitures? Does it help furnitures more, or does it help books more? Does it help wine more, or does it help kitchen products more? And does it help entertainment more, or baby products more? And how does that depend on the price of a product? Is a $20 product more likely to benefit or less likely to benefit? How does it depend on the rating of a product? Is a product with 4.5-star ratings more likely to benefit from recommendation, or is the product with a 2-star rating more likely to benefit? So that's sort of the second question that we're going to look at, which is after a person visits a product page, how does the recommendation influence their purchase propensity, and how does that depend on the product category, on the price of the product, the reviews of the product, and so on. So that's a little bit of setup on what we're trying to do and what I'm going to walk you through in the next several minutes. So let me next jump to describe the setting from which we gather data. And so this is important for us to be able to interpret the findings and to determine how generalizable are these findings and whether they would apply, for example, to if those of you are from retail settings, to your own retail websites. So our data comes from a field experiment we ran on a large retailer's website. Now, due to confidentiality, I cannot tell you the name of the retailer, but I'm allowed to say that this is a top 5 retailer in North America, top 5 online retailer in North America. And so this is based on an experiment we ran on their Canadian website between August 8th and August 22nd, 2013. So we were given permission to run an experiment for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, we ran an A/B test where each user was given a unique ID, and we tracked their behavior during those 2 weeks. And we were allowed to run an experiment with roughly 1.13 million users who visited that website during that period. And 80% of these users were in the control group, and they got no recommendations whatsoever. At the time of this experiment, this was the default experience on the website, where they were not doing personalized collaborative filtering-based recommendations, but they instead had other panels that they had on their website. 10% of the users got a view-based collaborative filter. And what I mean by that is it's a recommendation based on product views. People who viewed this item also viewed these other items. And then another 10% of users got recommendations based on a purchase-based collaborative filter. So in short, they got a message like people who purchase these items also purchase these items. So here's a sample screenshot where I visit a product page, and I might see a panel on the product page that says people who purchase this item also purchased, and it shows a bunch of other product options. The number of products displayed is a function of your screen width. So on a mobile device, you might see 2 products. On a desktop white screen, you might see, as I did here, 5 products. So some people got purchase-based recommendations, and for some others, they got view-based recommendations. So the message would have changed, and it would have said people who viewed this item also viewed, and you would get a series of product recommendations. The products displayed would be different for those users, and they would be based on views rather than purchases. The one other thing that I'll share here is that view-based recommendations and purchase-based recommendations, in my experience, play different strategic roles. When you say people who purchased this product also purchased these other products, that system is more likely to show consumers complementary products as opposed to substitutes. So for example, if I buy a laptop, then I might also buy a laptop cover, or I might also buy a mouse or something like that. I'm rarely going to buy multiple laptops at the same time. In contrast, a recommendation that says people who viewed this also viewed these other items, it's going to show you both substitutes and complements, because when I view a laptop, I'm also viewing other laptops that I'm considering, and I might also end up viewing some laptop covers and mice and so on. And so these two systems have a slightly different role in terms of showing substitutes versus showing complements. Okay, so that's a little bit on the context of this experiment. A little bit more on the data set we got. So at the time of the experiment, this retailer had about 82,290 unique SKUs on its website. All of these SKUs were fixed for the duration of the experiment. These SKUs spanned about 18 product categories and about 153 subcategories. So the product categories are things like home and pets, electronics retail, appliances, health and beauty, jewelry, apparel, and so on. And each of these categories have multiple subcategories within it. So for example, movies, music, and books is one category, and of course it has subcategories called music, books, and then movies. Now, our data set, as I said, had about 1.13 million users. 80% of them, or roughly 876,000 users, were in the control group. During the 2-week period, about 12,851 of these users actually purchased a product. So the buying population was 1.46% of this user base. And together they made about 31,409 purchases. So that translates to about 3.5 purchases per every 100 visitors to the website. For the view-based collaborative filter, there were about 124,000 users. Roughly 1.52% of these users were buying users during this 2-week period. And on average, each of these 100 visitors made about 3.75 purchases on the website. So as you can see, the number of purchases per 100 visitors went up, and the buying population also went up. For the purchase-based collaborative filter, there were about 137,000 unique visitors to the website. And if you look at what percentage of them purchased a product, then about 1.47% of them purchased a product. So that's not very different from the control group. And the total number of purchases per every 100 visitors was about 3.77. So again, the number of purchases did go up. So quite clearly, recommendations led to an increase in purchases just in the 2-week period where we gathered the data set. Now I'm going to say that everything that I'm going to share in terms of the impact on purchase volume is a conservative estimate, because in many instances a recommendation would have been made, the consumer would have considered this product, and after the 2-week period where we gathered the data, they might have come back and purchased these products. Unfortunately, we didn't have that data set because the company started running other experiments after our experiment ended, and so there was a lot of noise there, and we didn't really use that data. And so our data set is only for the 2-week period where recommendations were made, and within this 2-week period, we saw a non-trivial increase in the number of purchases by consumers who got recommendations. And my estimate is that probably, we are off at least by a factor of half, meaning just as many purchases were made after our data collection period as during the period. Now, if you look at which categories these purchases were made, whether you look at the view-based collaborative filter or the purchase-based collaborative filter, generally the patterns across both these groups, and including the control group, which I have not plotted here, is that for this retailer, a lot of purchases happened in the baby products category and home and pets category, also in movies, music, and books, and electronics, as you would expect, and fewer purchases in automotive and outdoor living and those kinds of categories. I'm going to take questions at the end, but I do see a question right now, which is a clarifying question, and it would be useful for the whole group. And the question was whether people saw recommendations prior to the experiment. And this retailer did not have a recommendation panel on its website at the time of the experiment. So before the experiment, they were not used to seeing personalized recommendations. And the control group continued to have the same old experience, and the treated group had a new experience on their website. All right, so let me jump ahead now and share our findings. I'm going to try and keep this discussion short because I'd like to spend a little more time in Q&A. So I'll give the high level, the headline results, and of course we can discuss some of the more nuanced findings in our Q&A portion. So first, what kinds of products benefited? Are these mainstream products or are these niche products? The long tail theory says that niche products finally have a chance on the internet. Partly that's because of supply side factors. Those supply side factors are things like the lower cost of stocking products with online retail than with traditional retail. And so you can stock many more products. But there's demand side factors that favor the long tail, and one of those is recommendation systems. So do recommendation systems help niche products? So let's look at that. So I'll start by visualizing the results for movies. So this is just for movies, and in this case, these were DVDs that the company was selling. So in black, continuous curve, this is the Lorenz curve for the control group, and in dotted red is the Lorenz curve for the view-based collaborative filter. So what this is saying is that for the control group, the bottom 40% of products generated about 5% of sales. For the view-based collaborative filter, the bottom 40% of products generated 1% of sales. Similarly, the bottom 60% of products generated about 15% of sales for the control group. For the treated group, the bottom 60% of products generated about 10% of sales. So the niche products actually lost market share. And you can see that in the Gini coefficient calculation. It is 0.6 for the control group. This is fairly typical in retail settings. I've looked at these numbers for many retailers. And for the view-based collaborative filtering system, it went up to 0.68, meaning sales were more concentrated. Here's what it looked like for the purchase-based collaborative filter. It's a qualitatively very similar result, in fact, even more pronounced for the purchase-based collaborative filter. So what's happened is that the top products actually increased their market share when these recommendation systems were turned on. It didn't push the back catalog. It in fact resulted in gains for top items. So this is for movies, and the question is, are movies different somehow from other titles, like furniture or baby products? So we also looked at all other product categories. So I have on the x-axis all the different product categories: apparel, appliances, automotive, baby products. I cannot show you that many Lorenz curves over here and make sense of it. So instead what I did was just compute the Gini coefficient for the control group minus the Gini coefficient of the treated group. It's negative in all of these instances, meaning that the top products actually gained sales in all of these product categories. All of these results are statistically significant. In fact, somebody here asks that the effect sizes seem to be somewhat small, and they're not, because a Gini coefficient changing by even a factor of 0.01 is considered to be a very large and meaningful change. Because remember, the interpretation of Gini coefficient, and I'll back up here, the Gini coefficient has a value of 0 implies all products have equal sales. And a Gini coefficient of 1 implies that one product has all the sales. So for a Gini coefficient to move from 0 to 1 in a catalog of 250,000 products implies a very, very dramatic change where you went from all products having equal sales to one product having all sales. So a change of 0.1 is actually a very significant change. So these are very significant changes in the mix of products purchased. You see that in some product categories, the effects are more significant. It's significant in all of these, statistically significant in all of these product categories, but the effect sizes are much larger in some product categories and slightly smaller in others. So it was 0.1 in movies, but sometimes it can be as large as 0.3 or 0.2 in other categories. So very significant impact in many of these categories. So this is for view-based collaborative filter. Here's what it looks like for purchase-based collaborative filter. One thing that a retailer can be sure of is that once they turn the recommender, the mix of sales is going to be dramatically changed. There will be new winners and new losers in your catalog once you turn these systems on. And that's essentially what these graphs are sharing. So I just shared these graphs of Gini coefficient and Lorentz curve. And what if we go back to what a Lorentz curve is? The Lorentz curve is asking what percentage of sales was generated by a certain set of products. So when we say what percentage of sales, then we are effectively talking about market shares of products. And so we are effectively asking what happened to the market share of products. Now, I told you that the total sales went up. So a question worth asking is, even though niche products had lower market shares, because total sales went up, is it possible that the absolute number of sales of niche items went up? Now here, when I say niche items and mainstream items, I'm purely defining it by number of purchases or number of times it's sold. So a product with very few sales is niche, and a product with lots of purchases is mainstream. And so the question is, we know the market share mix has changed so that mainstream or popular products became even more popular. But because total sales went up, is it possible that niche items got some lift in sales? So in particular, for the purchase-based collaborative filter, we saw a 35% lift in purchases. And for a view-based collaborative filter, we saw a roughly 9% lift in purchases. And so the question is, did most of this gain or all of this gain go to popular titles, or did some of this gain go to niche items? And so that's what I've tried to plot here. In these two graphs, the left graph is for the purchase-based recommendation system, and for the right graph is for the view-based recommendation system. In x-axis, the products are again sorted by popularity. The least purchased products are on the left side, the most purchased products are on the right side. And on the y-axis, instead of plotting the market share or percentage of sales, I'm plotting cumulative sales, the absolute number of purchases. Now what you will notice here is that for both graphs, the treated group is always above the control group. Meaning, if I look at the bottom 5% of products or the bottom 25% of products, cumulative sales are higher with recommendations than without recommendations. So in short, what is happening is that niche products actually sell more with recommendations, but the gains are disproportionately skewed towards popular items, so that in terms of market share, popular items gain even more market share than they did before, even though niche items gain a little bit in sales. So why is this happening? And this is happening because of the design of these most popular recommender systems. These systems, in fact, somebody asked the question, how are these recommended products selected? And really, these systems are collaborative filters. They're essentially saying people who bought this also bought this. People who viewed this also viewed this. For some product to get recommended, that product has to get purchased or viewed by enough number of people. So truly back catalog items, truly niche items that may be very close to my preferences, but haven't been viewed or purchased by other people, simply don't have a chance of getting recommended under the system. So what are the implications of this? Well, for producers, The promise of the internet was that it would equalize markets and finally give a chance to niche products or producers of niche items. And what this is saying is that if you aren't getting enough purchases, you're not actually going to get greater visibility from recommenders. Yes, overall sales will go up, but in terms of market share, it'll actually go down. And in terms of if you use market share as a proxy for clout in the market, for share of advertising dollars, for share of consumer eyeballs in terms of marketing spend, then it's actually going down. And so one has to really think hard about how do you ensure product discovery by recommender algorithms as well. So you have to think hard about that, and I'll come back to this towards the end of the talk. From a retailer's perspective, it's worth asking if the recommender design is consistent with product assortment strategy. If your strategy is to offer a broad product assortment and the recommender system is not exposing the consumers to the broad product assortment, then it might really be hurting your overall goals. From designers, from technologists' perspective, it's worth asking, how do we design these recommender systems so that they recommend relevant items but are immune to the popularity bias of these collaborative filters. So these were some of the findings from that first study. I'll quickly jump to the second study. So in this second study, we looked at what happens when a person visits a specific product page. Will they purchase the product or not? And how does that depend on product characteristics? How does that depend on whether this consumer is in the treated group or the control group, meaning they're in the group that is getting recommendations or not? So I won't set up this whole equation here, but essentially what we're trying to do at a high level is figure out the probability of conversion for a given user who is on a given product page. How does that depend on the price of the product category, the product ratings, whether this user is part of the recommended group or not, and so on. And so let me jump to the results and walk you through each of the more relevant ones. So I won't walk you through every coefficient here, and instead I'll talk you through the main ones. So first, we found that users in our treated group, meaning the group that got recommendations, had a 5.9% increase in conversion rate over users in the control group. So first of all, treated users visited more product pages because they got recommendations and they clicked on many of them and saw more product pages. Conditional on viewing a product page, meaning they actually visit a product page, they're also more likely to purchase a product. And this is a 5.9% increase in conversion rate among treated users. So how significant is that 5.9% increase in conversion rate? Well, one way to look at it, of course you can quantify the dollar value because this is directly contributing to an increase in revenues. But another way to look at it is that the economic impact of the recommender is the same as the impact of a 1.4 increase in the star rating of a product on a scale of 0 to 5. So in short, for a product to get recommended and the consumer comes to that page through a recommendation, the impact is the same as if the product's rating went up from 3.1 to 4.5. And that's a huge impact. To get your average rating up from 3.1 to 4.5 is a lot of work, and the recommendation is essentially doing that kind of work. Next, we looked at how the effect varies for different kinds of products. So first we looked at search versus experience products. So we defined search products as products that are easy to judge before purchasing them. So things like computers, cameras, printer ink, and experience products are those that can be best judged after using them. And it's important to see, touch, smell these items. So food, wine, movies, they're in our experience products items. So first, overall conversion rate is higher for search items rather than experience items. That makes sense. This has nothing to do with recommendations, and it's simply saying that when I visit a product page for a search product, it's easy to judge it before purchasing it, so conversion rate is higher compared to an experience item. Next, we looked at the interaction of that variable with the recommendations, and we didn't see any difference. So whether it's a search product or an experience product, we found recommendations have an equal impact for both those kinds of products. Next, we looked at utilitarian versus hedonic products. So hedonic products are those we defined as ones where there's pleasure-oriented consumption, which is motivated by some sensual pleasure, or it's fun, and it's not based on some direct value or goal. So things like movies, perfume, art, wine, these are what we defined as hedonic. Utilitarian are ones where there's goal-oriented consumption motivated by some functional needs, like office supplies, dishwashing detergent, vacuum cleaner. So those are our utilitarian products. And what we find, first of all, is that utilitarian products have higher conversion rate once a consumer visits the product page, which makes sense. You come to the product page with a goal in mind, you see the product, and you buy it at a higher rate than for a pleasure-oriented product like a perfume or wine, where there's no direct need for consumption, and so you need to be motivated through some sensual urge or push that's coming from the marketing message or something like that. Now, if you look at how that interacts with the recommendation, we find that, in fact, most of the effect of the recommender is coming from the hedonic products rather than utilitarian products. In fact, for utilitarian products, the net impact is almost zero, and it's there for some products, but on average, it's almost zero. It's just very small and slightly significant. But for hedonic products, on the other hand, that's where most of the impact of recommenders are coming in. So these are products where the consumer doesn't need to buy it, and the recommendation, whether it's the signal, the social signal, people who bought this also bought this, or people who viewed this actually bought this, or whether it's actually seeing a positive or more relevant item. But either way, that's what's driving the purchases. It's more so for hedonic products than for utilitarian products. And finally, when we looked at product ratings, on the left side, what you see is what you expect, which is that conversion rate is higher for products that have higher average ratings than for products that have lower average ratings, which is not surprising. But on the right side, what is interesting is that what I told you was that recommendations on average have a very positive impact on conversion rate, but generally the higher the rating of a product, the lower the impact of the recommendation. So what it's saying on the right side, the negative value, is that for every 1 point increase in the average rating, there is a certain amount of reduction in the impact of the recommender. So in short, the recommender system helps all kinds of products, but the impact on conversion rate is greater for products with slightly lower ratings than products with higher ratings. One way to view this is that once I visit a product page and it has a high rating, I don't need much else to push me to buy it, and the recommendation doesn't have that big an impact on conversion probability. But if it's a low rating item, and especially when it has a average rating around 3, and those ratings, some of them people love it and some people hate it, and that's because the product is right for some people and not right for some others. The recommendation actually pushes people over and convinces them to buy it, and so that's where it has a greater impact on conversion rate. Remember, I'm only talking about conversion rate here, and I don't have the time today to talk about how it impacts the number of page views, because when I see a recommendation, I'm more likely to click on that recommendation and visit the product page if it has a high rating. But once I visit the page, the conversion rate is influenced more for lower rating items. So just to quickly summarize, we know recommendations have a significant impact on choice. What I've shared today is that common designs, meaning collaborative filters, tend to favor popular items more so than niche items. And what I mean by that is all kinds of products see an increase in sales, but sales increase are much more for popular items than for niche items, so much more that their market share actually increases even more. Secondly, their role is more significant in some contexts over others. So for example, it's more significant for hedonic products than utilitarian products, more for lower price items, and more for lower rating items. I'm going to conclude by pretty much saying that not only these two papers, but in other papers, I've found that these systems have a very significant economic impact in retail settings, but also in other settings like media choice and so on. And so given the significant impact in retail settings, it's not surprising that we're starting to see some retailers actually monetize that, not just from the perspective of increasing sales, and I already mentioned there's a 35% boost in sales in retail settings like Amazon, but they're also monetizing it by creating an advertising market around sponsored recommendations. So both Alibaba and Amazon do offer sponsored recommendations on product pages. So you go to a product page, you will see a panel that has a few sponsored recommendations where other producers actually bid for that space and pay for it, and Alibaba makes a lot of money on that. Amazon has been increasing its revenues on those kinds of recommendations. And essentially what this is saying is, if you're a producer, there's a lot of value in focusing on those kinds of advertising auctions as well, in addition to traditional advertising and including search advertising, whether it's on Google search or Amazon search, but even sponsored recommendations have a pretty significant impact. So that's a little bit about our findings. I'll take some questions now, and I'm going to share a couple of papers. People who have liked this presentation tend to like these prior publications of mine, so please feel free to look at these, and they're easily available for download online.
Thanks very much, Kartik. I think you're reading the questions same as I am there, so I can focus on them, or if you have particular ones you want to start with.
Either is fine. I just happened to notice a few coincidentally as I was presenting.
Yeah. Well, here's one that's asking the question about consumers may see recommendations as a way to save on their costs, believing that there's additional information and others' choices. Maybe they're mistaken, or maybe they're not. Is that something that's testable?
Can you say that again, Gordon? I think I missed the first part of what you said.
Yeah. Some consumers may be using recommendations as a way to save on their search costs.
Right.
Believing that there's information and wisdom in other people's choices, either the purchase side or the view side. Yeah. So this person is saying they may be mistaken, but is there a way to test it? So I don't know. Is there a way to test that notion that recommendations do provide that incremental wisdom and it impacts choice?
That's a great question. So how much, I'm going to paraphrase your question and then connect it to a way to test it. So the way I would paraphrase it is, how much of the observed increase in purchases and also changes in choices. So it's not just increase in the number of purchases made, but I was going to buy A, but then I actually ended up buying B. How much of that is due to recommendation systems lowering search costs versus maybe it's a placebo effect, right? I see something and I get influenced and buy it. And that's a good question. It's hard to precisely quantify it, but I can describe one experiment we ran with one retailer, and it was a comic book retailer in Italy, where we had 4 to 5 different recommender engines, and one of them, by the way, was random recommendations. So we said, okay, let's not even figure out people who bought this also bought this. Let's pick up random products from its catalog, all comic books, and just show it to the consumers. And what we found is the following. We found in that study, for people who were in the personalized recommendations group, a 25% increase in sales. But for people in the random recommendations, we still observed it was, I think, in the 12 to 15% range in increase in sales. So it says even random recommendations increased purchases. but personalized recommendations increase purchases even more. But the caveat to that is now random recommendations increasing purchases, there could be even search cost value even in there, because even when you show random recommendations on a comic book store site, this is again maybe this great interesting comic book gets recommended which nobody knows about. It's in the back catalog and it shows up and people like the recommendation, and it might actually be lowering search cost. So I think even within the 12% gain for random recommendations, search cost is part of the story, but from the 12 to 25% change from random recommendations versus personalized recommendations, a lot of it is really all search cost. So there's no doubt there's a huge search cost story here.
Yeah, very interesting, and some further avenues for research, no doubt.
Right, right. Should I take a couple questions that I see?
Yeah, go ahead. Pick.
So one, and I'm not picking any favorites. I'm just seeing a few questions, and I guess I'll try and cover as many as possible. So Fabian asks, how much do you think this would change if we switch to a different kind of algorithm? So instead of a collaborative filtering algorithm to a content-based algorithm. So for those of you who don't know, a content-based algorithm uses no information on what others are buying. So it's not asking what did other people buy. Instead, a content-based algorithm is looking at the product that you're looking at and finding other products which are similar in terms of content attributes. A classic example is Pandora, where it recommends songs based on other songs that are similar. So my take on it is that the entire popularity bias that I mentioned with collaborative filtering designs will go away with content-based designs. However, content-based designs are harder to implement. Collaborative filters are very easy to implement. You don't need to have deep, rich metadata or attribute information about all your products. You just very easy to roll out even a lot of open source systems out there that you can use. So I think it's easier to roll out collaborative filters, but it has this slight popularity bias, which by the way can be debiased. And in some of my more recent work, we've looked at taking collaborative filtering designs which are easier to implement, and we've looked at how to debias them. So let me jump to one more question here. In your experiments, was there a way to control for the customer's product or category knowledge? The recommender effect would seem to differ significantly across different category knowledge or expertise. So we, because our data set was just what happened during those 2 weeks, we did not have access to data from this retailer on what these people were doing before those 2 weeks. So we don't know about the customer experience and their knowledge previously. So unfortunately, that's something I cannot comment on.
Are there other studies going, or are there other ways of getting at that, more of the the consumer or customer side of this? I think it's related to another question that was up there about understanding different user groups. It seems like the research that you're describing focuses on the products and the whole universe of products, and I think several people are getting at sort of the consumer or customer side. Is there a way to get at that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really interesting piece, and there is a way to get at it. It's pretty much if you have historical data on customers, and then you run an experiment like this, then we can look at how different kinds of customers reacted differently, and where we define different kinds of customers based on what they did in the past. So we can look at new users versus old users. We can look at customers with high lifetime value versus low lifetime value, with more experience on the website, less experience on the website, and so on. In my work, while I've worked with multiple retailers, I have had a hard time getting the kind of rich customer data to answer those questions. So the only thing that I can share is in one study we were able to identify new users versus experienced or prior users on the website. And we found a lift in sales for both the groups, and that both the groups found that the search cost reduction was helpful. And one of the things that we found was that for new users, there was a greater increase in terms of the number of product pages they viewed, more so than experienced users. And what that told us was experienced users perhaps knew how to navigate the website, whereas new users were a little more willing to click on recommendations and view more product pages. But the impact on purchase probability was similar, and overall gains were pretty high. But short answer, if one of you has that kind of data set, I would be more than happy to partner and look at that. But so far we haven't found that ideal data set. Now, one more question I see here, Dongling Huang asks, the Gini difference is highest for low volume products categories. So I showed a chart where I looked at Gini differences in different product categories, and the changes, the magnitude was higher in low volume product categories. So for example, automotive was where we had the least number of purchases, and that's where there's been pretty significant impact in terms of Gini coefficients. And I think that's just a function of when you have fewer purchases and there's a change, then the magnitude of the change becomes very high. Whereas when you have 50, 60,000 purchases in a product category, it takes a lot more to move the needle. And so that's what explains that the effect sizes seem to be very big in product categories where the purchases are fewer. I would focus more on statistical significance, and you'll see all of them have 3 stars, which indicates statistical significance at, in this case, at 0.1% level. So it's very highly significant, these impacts across all of these product categories.
I have a question. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit on, you mentioned in one of your studies you did a comparison of this kind of similarity-based collaborative filtering and random, and I think you said there were several other kinds of algorithms used.
Yes.
If I understood that right, I think it would be interesting to know what some of the other types of algorithms are. So there's a certain number, it seems like, that are very much similarity-based. Are there others that use other intuitions about how people make choices that have been set up already? And would that be something you could share?
Absolutely. So at a high level, there are 3 kinds of designs for these recommender systems. The first is collaborative filtering designs, and that's what I talked about in this study. And within collaborative filtering systems, there are many types. People who viewed this also viewed this. People who purchased this also purchased this. People who viewed this eventually purchased this, things like that. We've seen those. But they're all based on user similarity. The second, and by the way, within this category, there's also people like you like these products. So it's not based on a specific product you're looking at, but overall, all the kinds of things that you've done in the past, based on that, who are the others like you? So that's Netflix. So all of these are collaborative filtering systems. They're based on a community-based recommendation. The second category is content-based recommendations. So a question was asked about that, and I elaborated on that. And that's essentially the idea of recommending products that are similar to one another, not based on what others are buying, but based on the product descriptions. So the idea here would be that 2 songs are similar to each other because they're in the same genre, they have the same kind of instrumentation, they have the same tempo, and so on. So that's a way of defining similarity. So that's the second class. And those, as I mentioned, tend to be a little bit harder to build because you need a lot of attribute information about products, and they make sense only when you can automate the process of extracting product attributes. So they work great in text. So for example, news recommendations. Google's algorithms can pretty much look through news stories and use natural language processing algorithms to say this news story is about politics, it's specifically right-leaning, and within that it's about energy and so on. And so it can extract these attributes and say what other news stories are similar to it through text processing. Also, it doesn't work when you're selling across multiple product categories. So for Amazon or Walmart or these kinds of retailers, so many different product categories, it's hard to get rich product attribute information across all these product categories. So that's why the applications of content-based recommenders tends to be limited, used mainly in text-based settings. The third category is social network-based recommendation systems. And that's a very specific kind of recommendation, similar in spirit to a collaborative filter, but even more specific. It's not based on people who are buying or looking at products like you, but what are your friends doing on this website? So that would literally say the following friends have watched this show. Would you like to see? And the most popular class tends to be collaborative, followed by content, and then finally social. And there's other kinds of other systems that recommend items, but that are not personalized in any way. So for example, most popular items or recently purchased items. So there's no sense of personalization there. It's just a global rank of some sort.
Yep. Well, thanks. That's very helpful. I think it triggers a lot more questions, which we won't have the time to ask you and answer today, but people that are attending can follow up with you. They can follow up with us or both, and we'll be glad to keep the dialogue going. People are invited to reach out to you at kartik.h@wharton.upenn.edu. And I want to thank you very much for doing the webinar. I really appreciate it. And just a brief note that our next webinar will be on marketing mix modeling. There's danger in knowing enough to be dangerous by Bruce Gavarunas from Catalina Marketing, and that's on October 4th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So thanks again to Kartik. Many thanks to the members of the MSI audience who participated today in this member-to-member webinar series.